The Australian Financial Review.
Welcome to The Fin, Election 2025. I'm Lisa Murray with political editor Phillip Coorey, economics editor John Kehoe and economics correspondent Michael Reid.
Well, this is the sweetest victory of all.
It's Tuesday, May 6.
I have always believed in miracles.
Who do you trust to keep the economy strong? Who do you trust to keep interest rates low?
There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead.
The light on the hill.
Set it aflame again. Tonight, the Australian people have voted for change.
Hi Phil, John, Mike, welcome to our final episode of the series.
Hi, Lisa.
Good to be here, Lisa.
Yeah, great to be back.
We've been meeting every week with a panel of the Financial Review's finest political minds to talk about the election campaign. And now, finally, we have a result, and what a result it was. So in the last episode for the series, we're back to wrap it all up. Phil, Labor not only won the election, they really had a thumping victory over Peter Dutton's coalition. At the latest count, they have a very comfortable majority. And remember, we were talking about minority government for a lot of our episodes with 85 seats. They needed 76. And Anthony Albanese became the only Prime Minister to increase his party's seats at a second election. What happened?
People are still working that out, Lisa, but essentially Middle Australia completely abandoned the Liberal Party. The elements of Middle Australia that didn't abandon them in 22 did this time. And I think also in terms of summary, we probably saw a pushback against radicalism because we've sort of been well documented that Peter Dutton was deemed to be too much like Donald Trump, whether perceived or otherwise, and was punished for that. But also the Greens took a hammering as well. And as we speak, they don't have one seat in the House of Representatives. They may have lost all four, or they may hang on to one. So, from what I see, we just saw this rush back towards centralism, towards safe haven, compassion, those sorts of themes that Anthony Albanese pushed when he said all those years ago when he became leader he wanted to make Labor the natural party of government. And I think he just read the mood better, and all the problems that the coalition had in terms of perception were fueled by Donald Trump. You know, we saw what happened in Canada just this time last week, and I think we saw a similar version of it here, just whether it was women feeling insecure because of, the sort of push of nasty conservatism coming out of the US and people more generally, and just a whole confluence of events.
Phil, how did the polls get it so wrong? Of course, they had Labor winning, but definitely not the size of the win.
Like, if we talk about polls getting it wrong, that sort of brings back memories of 2019 where everyone was of the view Bill Shorten was going to win and he didn't. That's wrong. The polls, they were all to varying degrees saying Labor was going to win, either minority or small majority. That was the sort of consensus amongst the polls. So they were right in that respect. No one was predicting a Liberal victory of either majority or minority. But as you said, they just didn't pick up the swings. And look, it wasn't just the public polls. Everyone in the government is surprised to what happened, especially in Queensland. Queensland was meant to be the coalition stronghold. It wasn't meant to move. Labor thought they might get one, on a good day 2 seats there. They've probably picked up 5 Liberal seats and 2 Green seats. Queensland swung really heavily towards Albanese. Victoria was meant to be bad for the Labor Party. The Libs thought they'd get 3 to 5 seats there. Labor was always of the view they were going to lose seats in Victoria and have to find seats elsewhere to offset that. In the end, they took 2 off the coalition down there, and there was massive swings towards them. So no one's quite sure, but it sort of swung towards Labor in every state and territory, and quite emphatically. Except for Victoria, it was basically held station there, maybe 1%, but everywhere else it swung pretty hard.
Just on the polls question, Lisa, it looks like the final result is going to come in around 54 to 46 in Labor's favour on a two-party preferred basis. A lot of the polls weren't particularly wrong. Quite a few final polls came in at 53% for Labor, which is well within the margin of error. There was really only 2 outlier polls that got it quite wrong. One was Ipsos, which had 51%, and the other was the AFR's own Freshwater poll, which was 51.5% for Labor. The others, can stake a claim they did a pretty good job picking the final outcome, even if it came in a bit underdone.
We actually spoke to Michael Turner, who's the director at Freshwater Strategy, which carried out the polling for the Financial Review, and they also did the internal polling for the coalition, which has attracted some criticism. And he defended the polling and said one of the main reasons they got the winner right but the size of the win wrong was because of a large number of swinging voters right in those last final days. This is what he said.
Right at the death, sort of the Tuesday, Wednesday of the election, about 1 in 5 voters were soft. Basically means they're a swinging voter, which means that they're open to changing up their mind. And if you think about the entire dynamics of the campaign, going into the election, the coalition had significant lead over Labour, certainly a decent swing on the previous election. And over the course of that campaign, that dynamic fundamentally changed and it went one direction towards Labour.
Yeah, I mean, he sort of has a point, Lisa, but the other pollsters don't tend to agree with him. Freshwater's problem was that they just had the Liberal vote too high, I think, throughout the campaign. They had the Labor primary pretty smack on the last poll they did, but the Liberal primary was too high. Had that come down a few points, Freshwater would have been in the same turf as the other two polls. I'm not that critical of the public polling he did. The real criticism is the internal stuff he did for the Liberal Party, and that is a real point of criticism now. Essentially, it amounted to Dutton flying on a bad set of instruments because they were going to seats they thought they could win and they actually had no chance of winning and weren't defending seats they thought they had in the bag, including his own of Dixon. And this is the main criticism. I think the problem with the internal polling that was done for the coalition was that when you poll a seat or a nation or whatever, you try and make it as reflective as the population as possible. So you have a sample properly weighted for age, gender, and other various factors. But he included in his model how people voted in the referendum, the voice referendum, which is pretty strange. You go back to the voice, Lisa, that got thrashed for a couple of reasons, but the main one was people were angry about the cost of living and they didn't think the government was sufficiently focused on it. You go back at the time, interest rates were going up every single month. Inflation was running above 6%. And every time they turned on the TV, the PM was, talking about the voice. The repudiation of the voice wasn't just about people didn't like the idea of the voice. They wanted to send the government a message that its priorities weren't in the right place. And I think the Liberal Party drew false comfort from that result. They thought there was more to it. Actually, and we saw in the last week, when Penny Wong of the campaign accidentally rekindled the voice saying, it's unfinished business, and everyone pounced on it, but the electorate didn't really care. So I think that's the genesis of the problem, and it was wrong to put that sentiment into the internal polling because it wasn't there.
It was less of a culture wars issue and more of a priorities issue.
Yeah, they were protesting at the time. They thought the government's priorities were wrong. It was as much that as it was they didn't like the idea of the voice.
And based on that internal polling, right up to election eve, the Liberals thought the coalition were a realistic chance of claiming up to around 65 seats and dragging Labor into minority. It now looks like the coalition's only going to scrape into low 40 seats. So that's a huge discrepancy.
And also one of the things we shouldn't overlook in here as we break down the campaign and pick apart how bad the Liberals were was just actually how good Labor's campaign was. I think you've got to give them credit, both Anthony Albanese and the National Secretary, Paul Erickson, who's now racked up 5 pretty significant by-election wins and 2 huge federal election wins. Albanese came to Parliament vowing to fight Tories. Well, he's actually destroyed them, and he's created an existential crisis for the Tories, if you like. They ran a flawless campaign. I've not seen one so disciplined. Their ground campaign was absolutely devastating. They destroyed Peter Dutton with their ads and their social media, and this stuff will come out over coming months, but the way they bought into TikTok and all those other mediums and hit the target audiences immediately and quickly, stuff you didn't see on the surface, but even like when Peter Dutton in the final debate said, he wouldn't mind having a nuclear reactor in his electorate, within hours. Not just people in his electorate being targeted, but specific demographics in his electorate were being bombarded with TikToks and all sorts of things with that in it. They were absolutely ruthless, their campaign. They just outplayed the Liberals.
Mike Reid, you spent 21 days on the road during the campaign and were there when Peter Dutton, who also lost his own seat, as Phil said, conceded. What was that moment like on Saturday night?
Unsurprisingly, that the atmosphere in the function room at the W Hotel in Brisbane was pretty grim. Even before votes started being counted, polls showed that Labor was likely to win. So needless to say, Liberal Party members did not clear their schedule to attend that event. Probably for the first hour and a half or so, there was more journalists in the room than there would have been actual Liberal Party faithful. You know, we were being served the food and the alcohol, which would not usually happen at these events because there was just not enough people there. People then did start to filter in for Dutton's speech. Dutton stepped up. He delivered a very gracious speech. He got a really strong round of applause. And then he was not hanging around. He almost immediately exited after delivering that speech. And the people who turned up, there was nothing to celebrate, so they almost instantly left. So it was a very short party. It wrapped up probably by 10:30 p.m. or 11. Everyone was out of there.
And John, the opposition now have to pick their new leader. One of the contenders, Treasurer or Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor, he's been blamed by some in the party for failing to get the economic message right. Will that hurt his chances, do you think?
I think to a degree it will hurt his chances, but he still may emerge as the leader, given he probably on paper has the credentials with experience, policy understanding, economic sort of experience as well. Look, I think some of the blame on Taylor is reasonable, but I think some of it might be overblown. And I draw a bit of a distinction. There's a criticism for lack of economic policy or a lack of serious policy. Now, that's partly his fault, but it's also because Peter Dutton put very big constraints on Taylor about what the coalition was prepared to do. Around last year when Taylor was probably interested in going a bit further on tax and regulation and a whole lot of other things. Peter Dutton wanted to go with a smaller target strategy, rely on Anthony Albanese being very unpopular, cost of living pressures and sneaking home over the line. Where I think the criticisms of Taylor as a potential leader are more valid are he's not a very good retail politician. He doesn't perform particularly strongly in the media. He needs to connect better with voters. And he needs to get better at selling a narrative and a message as well, which he didn't quite do on the economy in this election. A lot of the policies were rolled out very, very late. A lot of voters didn't understand them or know about them, like the $1,200 lower middle income tax offset. Even the housing announcement on the first home buyer tax interest break was made on the same day as Labor's first home buyer announcement, their campaign launch. Now, that wasn't really Taylor's fault. That was a decision by the leader's office when to roll things out. He may be the best option. Whether he's a great option, I'm not so sure. But you look at the other contenders, I think Dan Tehan, probably a safe pair of hands. Someone said to me, won't set the world on fire, but solid. He could be a good option as either deputy or as the leader. Interim, I think most people are seeing this as a potential night watchman interim leader because they're going to be in power for 6 years, in opposition for at least 6 years, it looks like. And Susan Ley, not sure she has the numbers or the credentials to be the leader. Having said that, I do think they need to get women into senior roles, whether it's the deputy position, shadow treasurer. I think they've got to promote people like Zoe McKenzie from the backbench, who's an experienced political operative as an advisor to trade ministers in the past. She's been on corporate boards such as the NBN and others. She should get promoted into the shadow ministry and be a more prominent voice for women. Jane Hume didn't have a very good campaign on work from home and the Chinese spies, but she's probably still going to hold some sort of senior portfolio. And there's other people on the backbench as well. Maria Kovacic, for example, from New South Wales, to get people like that into more prominent shadow ministry roles.
Is part of the problem, though, that everyone's talking about appealing to the centre, but a lot of the moderate Liberals have lost their seats, and the people you're left with who are making the decisions in the room are more conservative, and are they going to double down on the coalition's agenda?
Well, look, I think there's a bit of a distinction to be drawn here. Everyone's saying the coalition, they're too right-wing, they're too conservative. Well, maybe on certain social issues that was the fueled perception by Labor, and there may have been an inkling of truth to that, whether it's on welcome to country ceremonies, Indigenous flag, even maybe the work from home to an extent. But if you look at their economic policies, they were actually not right-wing at all. They were quite left-wing for the Liberal Party. They were saying, we're going to increase income taxes, reverse Labor's income tax cut. We're going to have taxpayer-funded nuclear power. We're going to subsidise first home buyer mortgages. We're going to have a retrospective policy on gas reservation. These were not right-wing economic policies. Now, maybe sure on the social front there was, but certainly not on the economic front. They were quite left-wing for a Liberal Party by any historical standard.
And just, you mentioned the nuclear policy just very quickly. Is that dead and buried now, do you think, given this result?
Look, it was always crazy brave, but I think it was more crazy than brave. And the point is, as John said, the coalition cannot win the next election. If they're down to 45 or fewer seats, I can't conceive any circumstance in which they'd win more than 30 seats at the next election. It's never been done before. John Howard, I think, won 26 or 28 in 96, but no one's ever won more than 30. So if you operate on the assumption they can't get back into power at least until 2031, well, by then the country's going to be blanketed in renewables with gas backup. So I think the window, even if there was a realism or a reality to the nuclear plant, it's going to be too late in terms of the market will be crowded out by then. So, barring some epiphany by Labor that suddenly we need nuclear power, I think you're sort of whistling up the chimney on it now.
It was also clearly an electoral liability. When I was travelling with Peter Dutton at almost every press conference every day, he was asked, when are you going to visit one of the 7 sites you've outlined for a nuclear power plant? And he never did that throughout the entire campaign because clearly he realised it was bad to draw attention to this policy.
If I were the Liberals too, I'd just get back to renewables firmed by gas, and they've clearly lost 2 elections now, with sort of energy, climate being part of the reason, not the only reason. And you can advocate for more gas than Labor is and not quite have the rollout of renewables that Labor is advocating. But I just think, the nuclear thing just never really captured the public's imagination. People didn't hate the idea; they weren't violently opposed to it, but it just never took off.
I think they overreached on the nuclear policy. I mean, if they were going to have any nuclear policy, it maybe didn't need to go as far as we're going to have taxpayer-funded and identify 7 potential sites. It could have been something a bit more moderate, like we'll remove the moratorium, we'll work with the states, and over the long term we'll see if there's private sector investment that could potentially do this and not go as hard on it. But now it's maybe they need to think about scrapping it all together. I think the Nationals are keen to keep it, so it will be interesting to see where they emerge.
Yeah, it will be interesting. Okay, we'll be right back after the break to talk about the seats that are still undecided, the results for the Greens and the Teals, and what Labor might do with its huge mandate. Welcome back to the Fin Election 2025. I'm Lisa Murray and I'm talking with Phil Coorey, John Kehoe and Mike Reid about the election result. Phil, there are still some races that are too close to call. Which seats are we still watching?
Well, there's a lot, Lisa. There's about 14 or 15. The one a lot of people are watching is Adam Bandt's seat of Melbourne. He's behind there. He's in real trouble. He's the leader of the Greens, obviously, so... they've already lost 2 in Queensland. The last surviving seat in Queensland, Ryan, is on the edge, and we won't know that for several days. And there's a possibility the Greens have no seats. They go from 4 to 0. And if Bandt loses his seat, then Anthony Albanese's wiped out the leaders of both his rival parties, the Greens and the Coalition. It's a fairly big scalp, couple of big scalps for him. Look, the other one we're watching, Goldstein in Victoria. Now, that was won by Zoe Daniel, the Teal, back in 2022. She made the mistake on Saturday night of claiming victory. But Tim Wilson, I'm calling Goldstein for Tim Wilson. I think he will win it. When they last updated the count on Sunday night, Wilson closed from a deficit of 1,800 votes to 95. He's getting the postals are going 2/3 his way, and there's still a few thousand to go. So based on that, I think Goldstein's back in the Liberal column. Kooyong is following a similar trend, but not as pronounced. This is Monique Ryan, who took that seat from Josh Frydenberg. So the Liberal candidate, Amelia Hamer, is behind by about 900 votes as I speak to you. I still think Hamer could win that seat, but it's a bit tighter. And the other one is Bradfield. So that was the last Liberal blue ribbon seat, and we spoke about it on the podcast last week. John spoke about it. Now, Nicola Buller, she was the great hope, Teal hope there. she's ahead just by a cigarette paper at the moment, and that could still be retained by the Liberals, by Giselle Capterian. So, yeah, if all those results go that way, Lisa, the Teals could have a pretty bad campaign because they won 6 seats last time. North Sydney got abolished in the electoral redistribution. If they lose Goldstein and Kooyong, they sort of go from 6 to 3. Although they are a chance, I know no one sort of is interested in the ACT, but the seat here have been long, like everything in the ACT, it's sort of, Labor to the bootstraps, but Jessie Price is an independent here with the backing of Pocock, and she's close to pinching that. And the other one too is in Fremantle, which is another Labor seat, safe as houses. That's right on the wire too against the Teal candidate there. So whilst we're talking about this emphatic win by Labor, there is a potential for a bit of the gloss to come off, because you don't want to be losing seats like Bean and Fremantle. They're the seats you count from day one when you call an election. So, and what it's showing us is the sort of independent movement is, can cut both ways. And the Libs, it's still a catastrophe for them, but it will be a slightly less catastrophe if they hold Bradfield and they pinch back Kooyong and Goldstein, because that gives them enough of a sort of talent base to sort of start rebuilding if they keep those people.
I'm going to make a bold call here, Lisa, as well. We're talking about Liberal Party leadership aspirates earlier on, and it looks like Tim Wilson will come back into the fold in Goldstein against the odds, getting a pretty good swing towards him, despite the Liberals nationally getting a massive swing against them. I mean, I think if the Liberals want to be really bold, they should make him shadow treasurer, particularly if Angus Taylor steps into the leader position. Now, that would be big. He was only a junior minister late in the Morrison government, but he ran a very, very effective campaign on franking credits in 2018-19 that really helped the Morrison government win that election. He's been the chair of the Economics Committee. He understands economics, tax. He's incredibly hardworking. I know he's not the most popular bloke. Some people might find him, I might even say, a little annoying. But I tell you what, he's a very, very good advocate politically, and he's got a reasonably good policy mind on economics and tax too. And I mean, if Dan Tehan ends up the deputy, or he may have the right to choose his portfolio, may choose being the shadow treasurer, for example, if he does end up in that position, he'd be solid. But I do think the Liberals need to be bold and go with someone like Wilson. He's only in his mid-40s as well.
I agree. Just get him to annoy Labor rather than his colleagues, and he's been given a second life, and he won't waste it. And they got nothing to lose. They have nothing to lose. So.
Exactly.
And just talking about future leaders in the party, how's Menzies looking for Keith Wallahan? Because he was.
I thought you meant Sir Robert Menzies. He saved him last time, but that was like 60 years ago.
He's about 1,400 votes behind. I just checked, so he is closing in. Whether he can get over the line, I think it's
Keith.
Probably less likely that Keith Wallahan, in the seat of Menzies, probably less likely than more likely.
But there was a thing in Menzies last night, Lisa, where for a while it looked like 1,700 votes had gone missing. And so from the Doncaster East booth, pre-poll booth in Doncaster East, so the official record said Wallahan got 8,800 votes in that booth, but when they counted the two-party vote, they only recorded him as having 6,900. Both the Liberal Party and the Electoral Commission have been in discussions down there about it, trying to work out what's happened. It seems to be administrative rather than lost ballots, but no one's 100% sure. So as I talk to you, Tuesday morning, they're doing a full recount of that booth in Wallahan's seat, and possibly by the time this podcast goes to air, we may know more. If it is a case that votes have been lost and can't be found, they'll have to have a re-election, a by-election in that seat. If you remember back in 2013 when the Electoral Commission lost 3,000 Senate votes in West Australia, and they had to have a complete re-election for the Senate in WA. So at this stage, it doesn't look like that's what will happen in Wallahan's seat in Menzies. But if it is the case, I would bet that Keith might actually win it a second time round, because people probably didn't mean to throw him out. He's a nice guy.
And Mike, what do you think about the Teals showing this election?
Well, it's hard to say anything too definitive at this point while the counting's still going on, and there are some tight races where it looks like it could go either way. I think it's interesting that the Sydney Teals seem to have performed a bit better than the Melbourne Teals. I think that's probably indicative of the fact that maybe they've done a bit of a better job reflecting their electorates. I think if you look at Allegra Spender, for example, she got a swing to her in Wentworth. She's been particularly impressive over the past term, and it just shows when you elect an independent and they do a good job reflecting the voice of their electorate, they can be in there for a while, but if they're perceived to have perhaps gone a bit off script relative to what the voters would have wanted, that they can be kicked out. There's no guarantee that once an independent's elected that they're going to be there forever.
Or too left wing. You got to remember these Teals seats were Liberal seats, and and the reason that the Liberals got voted out is because 20% of the Liberals in those seats, changed because of social issues or climate change or something. But they're still economically conservative, and I think the two Teals in Victoria probably were more happy in the Labor left or in the Greens in terms of their voting tendencies, whereas Allegra Spender and Sophie Scomps and Kate Chaney and Curtin, the three have hung on easily. They tend to more reflect a moderate Liberal outlook rather than a Labor Green outlook, and I suspect that may be also a difference.
And I think, Phil, correct me if I'm wrong, but perhaps the anti-Semitism issue might have been more prominent in the seat of Goldstein and Bayside Melbourne, and also Kooyong to an extent as well. And I think that's probably helped Tim Wilson, who ran very hard on that issue, and Amelia Hamer to an extent as well in Kooyong too. So that's a little bit different to some of those Sydney Teal seats as well. Good point.
There was a very strong campaign by the Jewish community in Melbourne, especially targeting the Greens and some of those Teal seats. Michael Danby was the former Labor federal member, a big member of the Jewish community, was very busy down there targeting, rallying the Jewish vote.
And we should talk about the Greens. You mentioned that that those 4 seats are in trouble. Where does this result leave the Greens? I mean, their vote was that they actually held their vote, but just not in the right places.
Well, their Senate vote went up. Actually, they got a record Senate vote, but their lower house vote tanked. As I said earlier, I think consequences. They just wandered off script. They started talking about Palestine, and they just got associated with the radical left. The Trots took over the party. You could see it, Lisa, at the start of this year, at the end of last year, Sarah Hanson-Young, who's old school, put her foot down, went to see Anthony Albanese and said, all those bills we've been blocking on housing and everything else, don't worry, I've got it sorted. And they passed 40 bills in 1 week because she knew the holding back of these progressive bills in Parliament was hurting the Greens. And Albanese said this yesterday in his press conference. He said, the reason Max Chandler-Mather lost his seat is because he stood in the way of housing. But the other thing that they just got so radical, CFMEU rallies and Palestinian rallies every Saturday and this sort of thing, and they also stopped doing that this year too. Like Max Chandler-Mather, to my recollection, was allowed to do 1 public press conference this year. So they obviously knew they had a problem with this, and they tried to sort of dampen it down and get back to the environment and sort of more compassionate economic policies, back to core business. But as Albanese was saying last year, they're scaring voters away. Those left-wing voters who are thinking of deserting Labor for the Greens were scared away by this, and I suspect that's the reason. And the Greens have now just gone back to their original incarnation of a Senate party. But they are still very powerful. The one thing we haven't spoken about is the Senate now. Labor has picked up probably 3, maybe 4 senators, so they go to 28-29. There's 11 Greens. A majority in the Senate is 39. We no longer need Jackie Lambie, David Pocock, Lydia Thorpe, Fatima Payman or anyone else. Labor and the Greens now run the Senate. And that, I think, has been underreported in terms of the import of that. Labor can now pretty much do what it wants because the Greens tend to be very sympathetic to its agenda. And all those AFR readers worrying about their unrealised gains in their SMSF funds and everything else, I think you need to know that super bill is now probably is going to pass, the one they couldn't get through last term, where accounts valued at over $3 million, they're going to hit it with a Division 296 tax. There's no impediment now to any of that stuff happening, and this is something Labor's going to need to be a bit careful of in terms of if they get ahead of themselves.
Well, just hang on there, Phil, because that's a very nice segue to our listener question, which comes from Fiona from New South Wales. She asks, now that Labor has secured such an emphatic win, what will they do with it? What will they use their mandate for?
Well, they do have a mandate for the superannuation change, right? So because they tried to get it through last time, they couldn't. They kept it on the agenda and they took it to the election. So if they choose to put it in again, that's not breaching a mandate. Albanese is very conscious that he doesn't want to break the trust that's been put in him at this election. He's said it publicly and privately since election day. If they go ahead and be seen to abuse what's been given to them, they'll come off the boil pretty quickly and could be back in a minority after the next election. But my view is, Lisa, that Labor's greatest opposition over the next 3 years is going to be itself. It reminds me when Howard won the Senate in 2004 and he couldn't help himself and he overreached and he put in work choices and that ultimately killed him. Albanese's not going to do anything like that. But with the Senate now, he only has to worry about the Greens, and the Greens are going to be very compliant, I would suggest, given the hiding they've been given in the lower house. There will be a push inside the left to do some pretty dramatic stuff. I wouldn't be surprised to go after trusts, maybe have a look at some other taxes, go get really heavy-handed on IR, more so than they already have. There'll be a lot of pressure from the ACTU and stuff. So, and because there's no impediments to doing a lot of this stuff now, the Greens would only be willing them on. They're going to have to be mindful of that, and I think they are. But we'll see as time wears on. Just there's going to be a lot of temptation, a lot of siren calls because of the way the Senate's now set up.
If there is any big policy change that could be construed as breaking a promise or deemed significant, you would have to expect that Anthony Albanese would actually take it to the next election. I think the $3 million super tax is probably something of a formula for them where it was a broken promise, but it was never going to start in the last term of government. Voters were always going to have the chance to vote on it at an election before it came into effect.
The other thing here too that I think people are just starting to get their heads around, Albanese came to government or came to the leadership saying he wanted to make Labor the natural party of government. He's succeeded in doing that to the point. This is the first time I can recall, and probably the first time, going back 60, 80 years, where we now don't have an opposition capable of winning the next election in numerical terms. Obviously anything could happen, but I can't see them winning 35 seats. We're now at the point where it's a bit like the British Parliament, where you have a Labor Party, which is the only party capable of forming a majority, and then you have all these other parties, the Liberal Party, the National Party. You've got Teals and Greens and sort of leftovers of independents. But there's not a sufficient critical mass now outside the Labor Party to form government at the next election, and this is going to become apparent over time, and this is why it makes whoever leads the Liberal Party sort of important in terms of rebuild, but inconsequential of who's going to be their next Prime Minister, because they will not get in. They can't be in power until 2031 under the current circumstance. Even if Labor has a shocking 3 years and loses 10, 15 seats, that pushes them into minority, but the Liberal Party just, it will still be nowhere near being able to form government. And we've not confronted that in this country, not probably since the 40s.
Mm.
The other side of that coin is the National Party held all its seats, as it did in 2022. It's now the success story of the coalition in terms of it's adapted to its voters and kept its voters, whereas the Liberal Party's, lost at this stage more than 30 seats in two successive elections. Morrison had 77 in 2019. They're now down to 40, where the Nats have held. So, you could make an argument maybe it's time for them to split for a while so the Liberals can find their identity. But at the same time, if they stay in coalition, it's going to be more dominated by the Nationals and rural and regional Liberals. And so trying to win back that urban vote is going to become more difficult.
And John, what do you think Labor will use their mandate for?
Well, I think there's two schools of thought. Will we see more of the same from the first term? Bigger government, more spending, more intervention as industrial policy, going further on industrial relations are going to be under pressure from the unions, or are they actually going to put forward a serious agenda that drives productivity and economic growth in like Hawke and Keating did? They've got a bit of breathing space now. They have a large majority in the House of Representatives. Now, Jim Chalmers made some positive noise the day after the election about the Productivity Commission's got some reviews coming down the pipeline in the second half of the year. He said we're going to switch from primarily focusing on inflation in the first term to productivity in the second term. We'll judge him on the policies and actually what they do. Sounds good. And let's just hope they do grab the bull by the horns, because if it's more of the same from the first term, that's not going to improve people's living standards. People will still be grumpy. They can't just rely on a few interest rate cuts from the Reserve Bank. That's a sort of short-term sugar hit. If they want to actually increase people's real incomes, living standards, over the medium term, they need to do some serious structural reform, whether it's around the tax system, competition, regulation, a whole host of areas.
Mm-hmm. Thanks all for your time.
Thanks for having me, Lisa.
Until next election.
And a special thank you to all the guests we've had over the last 6 weeks during a very busy time. Phil, before you go, every episode we've been asking you to reveal your favourite quote. So what's your final pick?
I don't know if it's my favourite, but I think it sums up what happened on Saturday pretty well, and that was Peter Dutton, at the Jesus hour, if you like, on Thursday last week, when I think he knew things weren't going so well. He did a press conference in his electorate, symbolically in the electorate he was about to lose, where he urged voters to make the election a referendum not on the campaign but the last 3 years. And I think that was telling, because he was basically admitting the campaign had been an absolute shambles. And so he's asking voters just ignore the last 5 weeks, the horror show that had been the last 5 weeks of the Liberal campaign, and hark back to the last 3 years and ask yourself whether you still felt better off. And to me, that sort of summed up that all was lost, and it sort of explains now all the bloodletting that's going on in terms of how bad the campaign was.
Thanks, Phil.
No worries, Lisa.
This election really is a referendum not about the election campaign but about the last 3 years of government. Are you better off today than you were 3 years ago? And what will it be like under 3 more years, particularly if it was the Labor Greens government?
Thank you for joining us for the Fin Election 2025. I'm Lisa Murray with Phil Coorey, John Kehoe and Mike Reid. The Fin Election 2025 is produced by Lap Fan and Alex Gow, with thanks to Debbie Harrington. Our theme is by Alex Gow. Lap Fan is head of podcast, Fiona Buffini is head of premium content. If you like the show and want to hear more, follow us wherever you get your podcasts and consider rating and reviewing us, as it helps others find us. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to the Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. See you on Thursday when we talk about James Hardie's latest controversy. Bye for now.
The Australian Financial Review.